Hey, what's up, guys? This is video number 3 for the week. I just want to kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the events leading up to the Civil War, what caused the Southern states to secede, and some of the benefits that the South had going into this war versus the benefits that the Union or the North had going into this war. So you will read this week, or maybe you've already read the article on the election of 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln. He was the first Republican president to be elected, and he was elected on a platform of not allowing slavery to spread. Okay, that's really important to understand. Lincoln did not run on a platform of getting rid of slavery. Okay, he was a very intelligent man. He was a lawyer. He understood the Constitution. And thinking back on like Unit 2 that we did in class, hopefully you remember that under the United States Constitution, your property is yours, right? Under the Fourth Amendment, there is illegal, they protect you against illegal search and seizure, right? You have to have a warrant to take someone's property, and that warrant has to be signed by a judge, and there has to be evidence that somehow the property they're seizing was used in the commission of a crime, or it's evidence of a crime, or something like that. Well, slavery was legal, so you couldn't legally take a person's slave unless for some reason you had a warrant to do so. The other amendment that would relate to that would be the Fifth Amendment, which protects private property unless the government wants to compensate you for seizing it, right? That's something we kind of talked about a little bit with the building of the wall, right? The wall that Trump wants to build. In order to seize private property where they want to build that, they'd have to compensate the owners of that property with money. So if you wanted to free every slave in the South in 1860, you'd have to pay for that. That's a lot of money. Think about that. Think in terms of what we know about how expensive slaves were at the time. To purchase one, you know, you're talking $800, $1,000, depending on how strong or young or valuable you felt they were. And think about how many millions of people there were enslaved in the South. So it just wasn't feasible. So when Lincoln was running for president, he basically said, look, I cannot end slavery where it exists, but I will prevent it from spreading west. So during this whole time, this lead up to the Civil War, we were gaining land to the west, right? We talked about that. We killed all the buffalo. We killed all the beaver, right? We found gold, and people were spreading west. And as a result of that, the southern states were really looking to how they could continue to spread slavery to the West. Part of that was because of cotton production, right? They were producing all this cotton. They were using up the land, and they needed to be able to spread it west in order to continue to make profits off of it. All right. So that was Lincoln's whole thing. I'm just not going to allow it to spread to the West. I can't end it where it exists. It's not constitutional, not going to happen. However, when he won the election of 1860, when he was victorious and became the first Republican president, the states of the South did not believe him, right? So that's when South Carolina seceded, which means they left the Union. They said, we don't want any part of this. We know he's going to take our slaves. And 10 other states followed, right? So by the end of this, there were 11 states in the Confederate States of America, the CSA. They created their own constitution. They held elections. They elected Jefferson Davis president. And they truly believed that they'd formed their own country, right? Their own government. Now, Lincoln looked at this and said, you can't do that, right? You can't just leave the Union and call it quits and think that's going to be okay. And so that leads us into this fighting in the Civil War. The main first skirmish was the Battle of Fort Sumter. When the southern states seceded, there were still federal forts that were located within the areas of those states. And there were federal troops, right, that belonged still to the United States that needed to be resupplied. And so Lincoln had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to supply these troops in Fort Sumter? Am I going to send supplies there to keep them able to survive, or what am I going to do? And so when he did that, he did in fact send supplies down to the Fort Sumter. The people there attacked. They saw it as an act of war, and so the Battle of Fort Sumter in 1861 was the first actual military action of the Civil War. Okay, so that kind of gets us there. These kinds of conflicts had been building up for a while. As we gained more territory to the west, when California became a state, we had the Compromise of 1850 because we didn't know if California should be a free state or a slave state. Prior to that, we had the Missouri Compromise. What's going to happen? Is Missouri going to be a free state or a slave state? And then that led to some events with the creation of Kansas and Nebraska. The Kansas-Nebraska Act said, basically, we're going to let the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide if they want to be slave states or free states. And when they decided to vote in Kansas about that, a bunch of people from Missouri, which was a slave state, decided they were going to just like spill over into Kansas and start voting illegally, which led to a huge armed conflict. People were fighting. They were looting stores. They were burning buildings to the ground. They were killing each other. It was called Bleeding Kansas. And really, if you look at Bleeding Kansas, it's sort of a little microcosm. It's like a little snippet of what was to come with the Civil War. So every time we tried to have a compromise, it was just like kicking the can down the road, right? Like we weren't going to ever solve this. One of the things that Lincoln said was, look, we cannot continue as a country to be half slave and half free. We got to be all one or all the other. There's just no way. A nation divided against itself cannot stand, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty close, right? That's what Lincoln said. And so when he ran on his sort of, quote, anti-slavery platform, it really freaked the South out. And that's why they left. That's why they said, we're going to pack up our things. We're going to go. We're going to take our toys and go home. Really? Now, there's some things to think about in the terms of what's going to happen when this war breaks out. You have two very different economies. We've talked about that on the lead up to this. You've got the slave economy in the South, and you've got the industrial economy in the North. If you're going to fight a war, it's really good to have industry on your side, right? Because you have the machinery, you have everything set up to build the materials you're going to need to fight the war. You can produce weapons, you can produce food, you can produce uniforms, like all of the things that you're going to need, ammunition. It's going to be super easy for you to supply your army. In the South, they don't have that. It's not set up. So they're going to have more difficulty in being able to supply their troops. The North had more people, right? By like a gazillion. In the next video that I do, I'll be more clear and I'll have a slideshow that I'll go through with you, but they had a lot more people. And so really in the end, if they could find a way to just outlast the South, that would make it a lot easier for them to win, right? Because you can afford to lose more people than the South could afford to lose. It's called a war of attrition. And we'll talk about that again, like I said, next week. I'll do another video and I'll use this slideshow to kind of walk you through it. Other things that the South had that were advantageous is that the war is going to be fought primarily in the South. That gives them home field advantage, right? That means that they know the area, they know where they're going, they can strategize a little bit more easily. They had better military experience than the people of the North. In the South, it was kind of a culture, this aristocratic culture. And we did talk about that a little bit. So all of the rich families were sending their boys to military school. They were all going to West Point. They were all graduating from West Point. A lot of them had experience in the Mexican-American War. And so when the Civil War started, they had better leadership, militarily speaking, than the North did. Okay. So they had that. What else? Just the fact that they were more rural. They had more experience with their guns, right? They were going out hunting for food and things like that. So even not just the generals, but the enlisted men had a little bit more experience than the enlisted men of the North would have. Okay, so when you look at this on paper, the North has some good things going for it, and the South had some good things going for it. Truly, it probably should have been over a lot more quickly. The North had the crazy big advantage of the people and the factories and industrialism. They had some other advantages in terms of railroad production and the use of the new communications technology, right? The telegraph lines and stuff like that. They had huge advantages, and yet this war drags on, right, for like 4 or 5 years. And that's because of the grit of the South. That's because they were fighting to maintain their way of life. They wanted to start a country that's based on their own founding principles, right? States' rights. Like, we should have the right to decide what we want to do. No one's going to tell us that we can or can't have slaves, or how we treat people. So it's a really interesting start to this conflict. And yeah, like, there's just, it's really interesting to be able to look at the way that strategy played a role, the way that production of supplies played a role, and all of that. So that was kind of long and meandering. I know it's weird talking to nobody, like talking to this screen. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. If I said something that was confusing, please, again, don't hesitate to ask. Next week, I'll have some visual aids as we work through some of the key pieces that impacted the fighting of the war and the victory for the North in the end. So, all right, that's it for this week from me. And good luck, guys. Peace out.